Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I am Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue right along with our discussion of the legacy and the impact of the Roman Empire in the far extreme of Western Eurasia, and that is Europe. Western Europe in particular. And in our last lecture, we were looking at the career of Justinian. We saw how very early on in his reign he ruffled a lot of feathers in Constantinople among the Eastern Empire's elite. He favored men for their ability rather than their class background. Uh, and that allowed him to really draw upon the more talented members of Eastern Roman society. His choice of a consort, he married a woman named Theodora, and she's been one of the more maligned women throughout history. The assaults are as petty as saying that her father was a bear wrangler for the hippodrome, to more serious that she was among the more taboo prostitutes of Constantinople, with a very risque routine that she performed to entice customers. Um, and these events all influenced and were greatly added to the Nika Rise. But the Nika Rise themselves were sparked by Justinian's refusal to pardon two criminals belonging to two of the most popular hippodrome racing teams, the chariot racing teams. The Nika Rise nearly ended Justinian's reign before it truly began, but he called in the army and he had the rebellion squashed. Now, the rebellion, though it was a brief affair, it was less than 2 weeks in duration, it destroyed much of the city of Constantinople, and it spurred one of the more enduring legacies of Justinian's reign, his rebuilding of Constantinople. And a part of that rebuilding was, of course, uh, the building of one of the greatest architectural wonders of the Roman period, the Roman Empire, and that would be the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. It's still a marvel today. Today it is a museum in Istanbul, modern-day Constantinople. Justinian's reign is also memorable for the code of laws that he had issued. The Code Justinian. It was a compilation of nearly a millennium of Roman laws and legal positions, legal attitudes. He had it comprised by the most eminent jurist of the most legal eminent jurist of his day, the most legal eminent Roman jurist of his day. And lastly, Justinian is remembered for his valiant but ultimately unsuccessful effort at reuniting the Roman Empire. He brought Italy, more importantly, Rome and the bishops of Rome back into the Roman fold. He took possession of large swaths of North Africa, and even made inroads into provinces in Spain. His successors were unable to hold on to the conquest by Justinian. And when we last left off in our discussion, we last left off discussing the Christian divisions. Now, the early centuries of the Roman Empire, where Christianity had the dominant religion, bore witness to some of the more contentious disagreements over theological doctrine. In the Eastern and the Western churches, they developed separate doctrines of Christianity, and they split apart mainly over some very serious disagreements over the statuses of the bishops. Principally, the disagreements over the status of the bishops regarded the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome had the head of all Christianity above all the other bishops. That was the position taken by the bishops of Rome and their supporters, and it was contested by all the other bishops, who stated that the Bishop of Rome was merely first among equals, and that was first among equals by convention rather than by some established fact or or other deciding mechanism. Now, the Eastern churches will go on to gather under the umbrella of Orthodox Christianity, and the Western churches would gather under the umbrella of Catholic Christianity. And it further deepened the divide, as Orthodox Christianity looked towards Greek influences, and Catholic Christianity looked towards Latin influences. In the West, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, presided over the Western Church, and in the East, the Bishop of Constantinople, or the Patriarch, presided over the Eastern churches. Although the Eastern churches, like the Western Church, would splinter, and separate bishops would rise in largely ethnic areas, ethnic majority areas, where they had where they could further differentiate and use their own native languages. This would happen in Egypt with the Coptic Church, and this would happen in the Sudan, Axum / Ethiopia, with the Ethiopian Coptic Church. And those and in below the Nile, below the cataracts and so forth, they will follow an Axumite tradition, and we'll get to that a little later in our discourse, in our lecture series. Now, the churches and the positions held or the positions established by this division still exist today. We still have these divisions within Christianity. Now, another one of the major disputes between the early churches, or the early Christian church, centered on the Arian controversy, and that was a debate concerning the one of the more central aspects of Christianity. Now, the Arian controversy, the debate, involved the Arians, followers or adherents of a man named Arius. And Arius put forth the idea, and he believed truly that Jesus was created by God, and that the two of them were separate. He believed that Jesus was inferior and subordinate to God, and his followers, the Arians, they followed that notion. Now, their opponents maintained that Jesus was human, but also divine. And after about 50 years of debate, the official doctrine that was decided was that Jesus and God contained the same divine essence. And this decision is the basis of the concept of the Holy Trinity. This was just one of many debates that happened during this time. The Roman Empire, or the Eastern Empire to be more precise, although we can't say the Roman Empire since it was the only half still in existence after the 470s. It was struck by a particularly bad outbreak of plague in the 540s. And the emperor Justinian, he himself caught the plague, but he survived it. Now, Theodora, she also caught the plague, but she didn't survive. She died young. She died in 548 and Justinian, he continued to reign without her until his own death, nearly 20 years later in 565. Though he had lost much of the spark that characterized his early reign. Now, Justinian was succeeded by a nephew. He and Theodora didn't have any living children. He was succeeded by his nephew Justin, who took the name of Justinian's uncle and Justinian's predecessor. Now, Justin II, along with his successors, they would continue to rule from Constantinople in an unbroken line of Roman emperors until the year 1453. Now, the Eastern emperors and their subjects, they continued to call themselves Romans. They used the Greek variant of it because with the disconnect from Rome, the nascent Greek culture in the East and what was then Thrace, and Macedon and the Greek homeland, it crept back in. This nascent Greek culture kept back in, and so they didn't refer to themselves as Romans, as we would know it. They called themselves the Romanoi, which would still translate to Roman in Greek. But they lost the Latin language with the link to Rome or to Italy broken. They lost the Latin language, and all of the provinces in the East they slipped into this urban Greek culture, and the countryside, the rural areas, they slipped back into this. They slipped back into this whatever culture was there before the imposition of Latin or Greek. In Egypt, we see this. In Egypt, we see this because the Egyptian culture remained prominently under the surface during the imperial age or during the Roman imperial age, and it resurfaced as Christianity took hold. Most of the people in the East were in the Egyptian world, I should say, were not that well versed in Latin or Greek. Egyptian had to be used in the church services of the Orthodox Church. And in Egypt, the Coptic Church, their language, the literature, the liturgical language, the scripture language of the Coptic Church is based on the language of the ancient Egyptians. And the language of the Greek Orthodox Church is based on the Koine Greek, which was the precursor to modern Greek, and it was the Greek popularized or descended from Attic Greek, the Greek of Athens or Attica. Now, as the territory of the Eastern Empire shrank, the city of Constantinople remained safe behind those walls that I spoke of in our last lecture. Now, a combination of a sack by crusading soldiers from the Holy Roman Empire during the Fourth Crusade, and repeated attacks by the Ottoman Turks, and the introduction of gunpowder along with cannons into siege warfare brought the city's defenses down on May 29th, 1453. Now, because the Eastern Empire finally fell in 1453, 1453 is also another day that is used to mark the end of the Roman Empire. It is not the last end date of the Roman Empire. Many stretch the Roman Empire even further. Charles the Great, or Charles the Magnificent, better known as Charlemagne, he was crowned on Christmas Day 800 with the title Charles Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was one of the more coveted titles in Western Europe until Napoleon the First, Emperor Napoleon I of France, had the Holy Roman Empire disbanded in 1806. The Russian Tsars were regarded as the heirs to the Roman Caesars, with Moscow being considered the third Rome. And the last Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II, he ruled until 1917. And there are still male line Romanov claimants to the Russian throne, to the imperial throne. Now, the United States is also seen as an heir to Rome. The founders of the American Republic were they were kind of obsessed with the Roman Republic themselves, and they consciously modeled their government after the Romans. That's why the United States has a legislative body called the Senate. That's why the architecture of Washington, D.C. looks the way it does. That's why the eagle is the national symbol of the United States. And that's also why the United States had the Capitol Hill. These are all consciously modeled after the Roman Empire. They're meant to sort of emulate their approval of Roman governing practices. But the United States has an heir to Rome is primarily argued by Americans. And it primarily argued that the United States and the American Republic, or the American Republic, is a revived Rome and Roman Republic. All right. And now that we've sort of finish that up, I'd like to move on and move back to an area that we discussed earlier, but we haven't really discussed in quite a few lectures, and that would be the Iranian Plateau / Persian / what we can call Persian Empire, or just Persia. Now, this will be us taking a step back in our narrative. We're currently in our narrative around the year 565 with the death of Justinian. We're going to have to take a few steps back and look at the developments in the ancient Near East outside of Rome's borders. We're going back to the period of the middle to late Roman Republic. We're going back quite a few centuries. And we're going to do this to sort of bridge the gap to see what was happening on Rome's eastern borders. The lectures detailing the rise of Celtic civilization and Germanic civilization, they dealt with actions on Rome's western borders. this lecture and the preceding lecture, we're going to have two lectures detailing the Persians, and specifically the dynasties that came to rule in Persia, the Parthians and the Sasanians. Now, the Parthians, and to be more specifically, the Aracid Parthians. And Aracid is a Greek term, Sasanian or Sassanid, Aracid, and Achaemenid. These are all Greek terms used to describe the descent of the ruling elite from one person. Now there and these this ruling elite group, this ruling elite Parthian group, they're known as the Aracids due to the first king listed in their tradition, Aracis, and he lived during the 3rd century BCE. Now the Parthians, they originally hailed from the steppes just north of Persia, just north of modern day Khorasan, on the shores of the Caspian Sea and what is now Iran. They moved into Persia. They intermarried with the existing Iranian peoples. Now the Parthians are remembered by the Persians or the Iranians. They remember best as nomadic warriors. They became the great heirs of the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Near East by the time they came into contact with the Romans. Now, our lecture on them will focus on the Parthian rise to dominance in the ancient Near East, and we will also explain how they became the great imperial rivals to the Romans for roughly 300 years. Now, this is a difficult topic to broach. The Parthians left very little literary sources. They remained a military elite. They used Greek and Aramaic for most of their inscriptions. And that's because Greek and Aramaic were the two great commercial languages of their era. Greek was the great commercial language for these Hellenistic cities, and Aramaic, if you remember from our lectures dealing on the Near East, Aramaic was introduced as the language of the desert caravans. Aramaic was popularized by the Babylonians, and Aramaic became the main commercial language of the Near East. Aramaic became the main language of the Near East. It displaced Akkadian. So they adopted the two great commercial languages, the two great primary languages of the Near East. For their official inscriptions and coins. Now the inscriptions and the coins that they left behind, they're not very informative. Much of our information about the Parthians comes from Greek and Roman sources, and these sources are often hostile or dismissive toward the Parthians, and that's because they were frequently at odds with the Parthians. Now, these accounts of the Parthians are generally negative, and they focus primarily on the discord between the Romans and the Greeks and the Parthians. We will also focus on the great imperial clashes in our discussion, in our lecture on the Parthians. We will also focus on the great imperial clashes between the Romans and the Parthians and the resulting relations in the Near East. Now, the Parthians were part of a large grouping of nomadic Iranian-speaking peoples who lived in Central Asia and the borders on the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern provinces of the Roman Empire at this point. They appear in history first as client kings of the Seleucid kings. And of course, these Seleucid kings were the great heirs of the Argead Empire's Asian territories. Or better yet, the Near Eastern territories. The Parthians were to rise initially due to the severe defeats that the Seleucid kings suffered at the hands of the Romans. In the year 190 BCE, the Seleucid king Antiochus III was decisively defeated by the Romans at the Battle of Magnesia. The defeat and the subsequent treaty forced on the Seleucids was a mortal wound for their empires. The Seleucids emerged from that war as a second-rate power in the Near East. Their once great empire that at its height stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Hindu Kush was reduced to basically nothing more than modern-day Syria, with Antioch and a couple of other territories in modern-day Turkey. The The Parthians replaced the Seleucids in the eastern portion of their empire in 148. The Parthian king Mithridates I defeated the Seleucid king Demetrius II in battle, taking him captive. Now, Mithridates I eventually released Demetrius II, and the reason he did it was to create instability in the Seleucid kingdom in the year 129 BCE. Now, Mithridates I, he cemented Parthian control in Persia and set the Parthians up to become the great power in the Near East. His successors nearly lost the advantage that he provided due to the careers of Mithridates IV of Pontus and his son-in-law Tigranes the Great of Armenia. Now, privately, those two decided to divide the remnants of the Seleucid kingdom between themselves. Mithridates IV would later go on to clash with the Romans, and Tigranes the Great, he controlled the he went on to gain possession of those rich provinces in Mesopotamia. Now, Tigranes the Great eventually assumed the title King of Kings, and as we have discussed in past lectures, pertaining to Mesopotamia in particular, the title King of Kings was an ancient title that carried very weighted social status attached to it. The Amenid Persian kings used it as an imperial style back during their dominance in the Near East. And the title harkened back to the reign of Sargon of Akkad, because Sargon of Akkad, Lord of the Universe, King of Kings. So one of the oldest imperial titles in the Near East is being assumed by Tigranes the Great of Armenia. Now, the Romans played a role in allowing the Parthians to expand to enrich themselves by gaining access to the provinces of Mesopotamia. And they did this by breaking the power of Armenia. Now, Lucullus, the Roman commander who was first sent to defeat Mithridates VI of Pontus, pursued Mithridates to Armenia, where he sought shelter from Tigranes the Great. Lucullus defeated both of those powers, breaking Armenia's power in Mesopotamia. Lucullus also imposed a treaty on the Armenians that made Rome the hegemonic power over both Pontus and Armenia. This settlement was a part of the Eastern arrangement that Pompey had put in place during the First Triumvirate that reorganized Asia Minor and brought Syria into the Roman Empire. Armenia was reduced to her original limits, centered on Lake Van, and the area of Mesopotamia that was too far east for the Romans to easily control was abandoned. This allowed the Parthians to move in and establish themselves in Mesopotamia. Now, the Parthian kingdom was diverse. It was a true composite state. The Parthian kings, however, functioned more as warrior elites than bureaucrats and administrators. They never had a figure like Darius the First or Darius the Great, somebody who could, a great king figure who can come in and reorganize their imperial holdings, putting in place a sound imperial or royal bureaucracy. The Parthians remained just their warrior elite over the peoples of the Near East. They were not well remembered later in Persian history. They were not thought of as Iranian liberators who ousted the Macedonian Seleucids. The Parthians kings, they styled themselves as Phil-Hellene kings. They encouraged the Greek and Aramaic populations at Seleucia, at Tigray, and Ctesiphon to pursue economic interests, and they promoted Babylonian and Greek culture. They did not try to overlay Persian or Iranian culture over these peoples. The Parthians also encouraged the worship of different religions in the Near East. The later Persians saw this as a failing. The Parthians were seen as interlopers who were not strict Zoroastrians. They did not subscribe to the monotheistic worship of Ahura Mazda. Now, the Parthians were we remember them as being remarkably adaptable to ruling their empire. They promoted trade networks in Babylon, which was the fiscal heart of their empire. They created a stable, bureaucratic class. They protected the caravan. They did not develop the administration to really tie a lot of people to them, but they did enough to ensure that the area was stable. Shipping sites along the Persian Gulf were supported and allowed for a bustling maritime trade. The Parthians shared power in the Persian heartland with the Iranian elites. They also retained their close connection to the nomadic peoples of Central Asia, and they used the connections with those nomadic people to recruit soldiers and horsemen for their armies. The Parthians never established, had I stated earlier, the stronger social institutions that are needed to successfully govern an empire in the long run. They never developed the administrative institutions to assimilate their subjects to into simply being a collection of peoples, into being a solid body of citizens behind a ruling dynasty, or a solid body of citizens that are tied to an empire. They remained until the end a warrior elite. They never were able to collect taxes on the scale of imperial Rome. They were supported by their nomadic allies, and they ruled with the compliance of all the different groups living within their imperial boundaries. Now, the Parthians and the Romans, they began to clash with one another relatively late. They had very cordial relations with each other, but that all changed in 63 BCE. By 63 BCE, there were only two great powers in the Near East. There were no great imperial rival to the Romans in the West. There was only this large, bland region that the Celts inhabited, and Julius Caesar was eyeing that for conquest. In the East, the Seleucids had been done away with. The Egyptians were they weren't client kings, but they were very much as friends and allies of Rome. The only great power left that had no treaty of subordination or no subordinate role to the Romans were the Parthians, and the Parthians were expanding. Everybody could see that the Parthians were viewing themselves as the heirs of Sargon in the East. So in order to sort of shore up and show their dominance in this region, because at this point the Romans have provinces in what we now call Asia Minor or the Anatolia. They have provinces along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. The Romans, they began to take this arrogant view. Well, they already had an arrogant view. They first began treating the Parthians in this arrogant manner back in the year 92 BCE, and this goes back to the dictatorship of Sulla. Sulla was it goes back to the career of Sulla, I should say. But at this point, Sulla was serving as the governor of the province of Cilicia. Cilicia is in southern Asia Minor. Sulla received a group of Parthian envoys, and the manner that he received them and how he treated them denoted Roman superiority and Parthian inferiority. The reception was not well received by the Parthian king. He was outraged that its envoys agreed to such a meeting and agreed to be treated in that manner. It reflected on him. He had the envoy beheaded for their folly. Now, this meeting set a precedent for all future contact between the Romans and the Parthians. The Romans never forgot that Sulla had greeted the Parthians as inferiors. Now, the Roman attitude toward the Parthians changed in 53 BCE when Marcus Licinius Crassus suffered a stunning defeat at the hands of the Parthians. The defeat of Crassus threw Rome into crisis. He had taken nearly all of the legions stationed in the eastern provinces with him. His army numbered around 55,000 men. Moreover, Crassus was a member of the ruling elite, the First Triumvirate. During Caesar's Gallic campaigns, Pompey the Great and Crassus, they grew jealous of Caesar. Caesar was having a great success. There was nothing but good news coming from Gaul. Nothing but good news coming from Gaul with Caesar. They wanted a command of their own. They wanted a military command of their own, so that they can remain on even footing with Caesar. They all wanted to share in the prestige, in the veritas that Caesar was amassing. And Crassus decided to create in the east what Caesar was doing in the west. He wanted to build a military legacy for himself, and he wanted to enrich himself. Crassus was the Roman commander who defeated Spartacus's slave rebellion and was the richest man in Rome. In fact, he's one of the richest persons to have ever lived. In 55 BCE, he launched his campaign. He stumbled into battle at a site called Nika Rise in modern-day Turkey. It's near the side of Haran in southeastern Turkey. He stumbled into battle, and the battle was significant for a number of reasons. First, the conditions of Nika Rise were not well suited for the Roman style of war. The battlefield, the battle site it's dry and it's hot. Second, Crassus displayed the typical Roman arrogance towards non-Romans or barbarians. He ignored the advice of his local guide and allies. Third, this is the first battle that pitted a mainly infantry Roman army against the mainly cavalry Persian or Parthian army. The Parthian army deployed horse archers, and that was their decisive wing in battle. The Iranians or the Persian-speaking peoples, they traditionally had cavalry, had their shock troops, had their main offensive weapon in battle. And this, of course, heralds back to their Central Asian ancestry, their Central Asian cultural roots. Nearly every force that comes from Central Asia, they have access to these horses, so they primarily use horseback warriors. Now, the Parthians decisively defeat Crassus. Crassus's opponent was a man named Surena, and Surena seized the local water sources, which deprived the Roman army of access to fresh water and provided an almost limitless supply of arrows to its men. The Roman army was worn down after constant arrow volleys. The men of the Roman of the legions, they kept their discipline, hoping that the Parthian infantry would come in and close with the legions, come in to close, and that simply meant to engage in the sword fight with the legions. The Parthian army never did that. Everyone knew the Roman way of war by then, and they knew that the Romans would just send their legions after them, and that the legions were and that they had a very tough fighting reputation. The men grew tired because the Parthian infantry never came. It was just this constant assail of arrows. It was hot. It was dry. They were unused to the terrain. They were unused to these conditions, these battle conditions. Crassus was unable to keep order, and the army was decisively defeated. Crassus was killed along with 20,000 Romans. About 10,000 Romans were captured. The Parthians later resettled these men in colonies in Central Asia. This defeat was a disaster. All the legionary standards were captured. When the Romans found Crassus's body, his head had been cut off, and it was sent to the Parthian king. The Parthian king was delighted, and he immediately had Surena executed. And this was done to eliminate a possible threat to his position, to his reign. Now, Crassus's death put Caesar and Pompey on the course for their showdown. His death, the death of Crassus, was a real sting to Roman martial pride. The old patrician class, down to the reign of Caesar Augustus, would periodically call for an eastern campaign to avenge Crassus's defeat. The defeat of Crassus led to no major changes along the Parthian Roman frontier. The Parthian army did not have the siege trains nor the logistical capabilities at the time to launch a long-distance campaign that could threaten or capture the Roman Eastern imperial provinces. This was a calamity for the Romans, and Mark Antony twice during his period of control in the eastern provinces, he twice led expeditions to the east to fight the Parthians. These operations were strategic stalemates. Now, when Caesar Augustus emerged supreme in a contest with Mark Antony, he inherited the eastern frontier that was largely the same as the eastern settlement of Pompey the Great. Caesar Augustus also inherited an angry Roman elite who were still fuming over Crassus's defeat. Now, Augustus was a savvy diplomat. He knew the drawback associated with campaigning in the arid climate of Mesopotamia. He knew that water was in limited supply. He knew that there were few strategic invasion routes. He knew that Armenian support would be key to any success in a future campaign in that region. Now, Caesar Augustus was weary about expanding the empire's boundaries. He had a monumental task before him in just consolidating his power and his position, and another monumental task in reorganizing and managing the imperial provinces. He was loath to expand beyond the Euphrates. We will break here, and when we come back, we will look at what Caesar Augustus did. We will look at how he solved the problem of the eastern boundary, how he satiated the patrician calls for revenge for Crassus' defeat. As always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. And when we come back, we will continue our discourse.